Welcome to the Behind the Grantmakers Curtain series. This collection of interviews with different foundations aims to help grant seekers craft more effective grant proposals that win funding. This series is brought to you by Instrumentl, the institutional fundraising platform. If you're looking to bring grant prospecting, tracking, and management to one place, you can do so with Instrumentl. On average, nonprofits apply for 78% more grants within a year, helping them win more grants. To do the same and find new good fit funders for your nonprofit, try Instrumentl 14 days free by visiting www.instrumentl.com. That's www.instrumentl.com. Now, let's jump into today's show.
Today's conversation features the president and CEO of a community foundation based out of Georgia. We explore different topics around what exactly grant makers are looking for when grant seekers are applying for their foundations, as well as different trends and approaches to how they have revised their grant making strategies through the years. It's an insightful conversation where you'll learn a lot about helpful ways to make your application stand out, tell the right stories that you actually get funding, and what you need to do in order to ensure that you have enduring impact from your programs and initiatives. I'm so excited to bring onto the stage today Shari Martin, who is the CEO of the Cobb Community Foundation. After 5 years on its board of directors, including one as board chair, Shari stepped into the role of executive director of the Cobb Community Foundation in 2017 and was named president and CEO in 2019. Her background of 30 years in the wealth management industry provided a firm foundation for her to lead this fast-growing organization, and we're thrilled to have her on today as she shares more about the Cobb Community Foundation and their grant-making efforts. Shari, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd love for you to kick us off by telling us a little bit more about your foundation, the foundation's origin story, and who you aim to fund today.
Sure. Well, Will, thanks first for having me on. It's a pleasure. So we actually started as a local fund of the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta back in 1993. Our founder is Jim Roden, and the first fund that he created was actually for the East Cobb Rotary Fund. And through that process, he realized that there was a real need for an organization, for a community foundation that focused strictly on Cobb and the immediately surrounding area. So fast forward about 2005, we realized that we really wanted to be a standalone organization. So we obtained our own separate 501c3. And from that point, our focus has been strictly Cobb County in terms of our community grant making. That is our focus. But of course, our fund holders, and we have donor advised fund holders, folks who've started unrestricted funds, field of interest funds, scholarships. We even hold employee assistance funds, as well as agencies. But our fund holders can give to any nonprofit 501c3 anywhere, as long as it's consistent with our overall mission, which is to make a positive impact in the world.
That's fantastic. It sounds like you guys have a full suite of offerings there. When you think about that full suite, I'm curious if you could describe your overall grant making strategy. How do you guys prioritize, who you fund for your foundation?
That is such a great question, and it actually has a different answer than I would have had a couple of years ago. So first, let me say, when it comes to the grants that our donor advised fund holders make, we provide them guidance and information about the issues that are impacting our local community and the organizations that are doing work in our community. But in the end, it's up to them to advise us on where they want the dollars they've contributed to their donor advised funds to go. So with this answer, I'm really going to be speaking about what I call our community funds, those unrestricted funds that are in the discretion of our board or our grants committee in terms of where those dollars are going to go. So a few years ago, actually, it seems like a lifetime ago now, but it was the middle of 2019, we engaged a group called Georgia Center for Nonprofits to do a study of Cobb County and to look at the human needs in Cobb County at the micro level, looking down all the way to the individual census tract in the community. And then for each of those census tracts to look through it with 4 lenses. One was education, housing, economics, and transportation. And then the last one was health. And from that, we developed a heat map that you could, again, look at each census tract through any of those lenses and see with color coding of red for bad and green for good, where the greatest need was. And then we overlaid that with where nonprofits are that are serving those needs. And one of the things that we found was, and first to no surprise of anyone, was that unfortunately, Cobb County is, like many communities, one of the haves and the have-nots. So we have extremes of wealth and financial security within the same county. But what we also found was that in some of the areas of greatest need, we have less nonprofits than in other areas. And so we started focusing in on that. And we decided as a community foundation for our grant making. Now, I'm setting COVID aside, and we'll come back to that. But for our grant making, our goal was to focus on what we called the red zones, which are those areas that basically are in need across the board and have, frankly, the greatest opportunities for growth and the greatest opportunities to thrive because of where they are now. And so our goal is to help those specific communities to thrive. And that's where our non-COVID related grant making is focused.
I love that. That data-based approach is just so reflective of your past experiences as well, I'm sure, because that's something across industries that taking that sort of microscopic approach has just been championed across the board. And it's so impressive to see that you guys have been able to layer in those multiple data sources to come up with a game plan in terms of how it shapes your grant making strategy. On that point, you kind of talked about the last few years, how you have reevaluated or refreshed your grant making strategy. Was that an easy effort for you? I'd imagine it took a while or a multi-year horizon for you coming on board to pitch that vision as well. How has that been as an overall process? How often you guys reevaluate that? And where do you guys see that going in the years ahead from the foundation that you've begun building here?
So let me just say that I give tremendous credit to our board, because doing this study, that idea came out of our former grant making process. And frankly, where it came from was one of the nonprofits in one of our training sessions, which is a whole subject into itself, that we have to have training sessions on how to apply for a grant. But setting that aside for the moment, one of the questions that was asked was, so what is your focus? And my answer was, well, these were impact grants. And so it was to look for situations where a small amount of money could make a significant impact, helping those organizations that were doing significant work in the community with new programs or expansions of existing programs. And he said, yes, but what is your focus? And my light bulb went off. It's like, we don't have one. And so that, frankly, was when I just realized we've got to get data, and we've got to become data driven in our grant making. And so I went to my board and said, look, we need to get a study done. And I've already priced it out. This is how much it's going to cost. And that money was not in the budget. But I said, I can raise this. And they got behind the initiative and said, okay, we're on board. And our plan is roughly every 3 years or so to have that study updated. And one of the things that I really love about focusing at the census tract level is it's going to make it easier to measure if we're making a difference. And of course, that is such a loaded topic, because we all know that there are so many potential reasons for change. I mean, the old correlation does not necessarily imply causation. But we do feel like by focusing on smaller areas, we will get a better feel for what's really helping to move the needle. and what's not.
And something I just want to highlight for our listeners is how common that is, right? Where the importance of the board support stems not just from the grant maker side of things and the grant seeker side of things, but across the gambit. And so it's great that you've been able to get that support from your board over the years. And shifting gears just directly talk about that application process, since you highlighted that topic, I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what is the most common mistake that you have seen applicants make when applying specifically to your community foundation.
I would say it's not being able to tell their story well. And what I mean by that is I want to really understand what these dollars are going to be used to do, even if it's just general operations. Then I want to understand what it is that your organization really does. And in some cases, when someone shares their mission statement may totally get there, but in some cases it doesn't. I want to have a picture. I want to be able to see in my head, what does this look like in terms of what you do? If it's just, we help families to thrive. Great. How? What does that look like? What does that mean? I don't want to hear just the buzzwords. I really want to be able to envision what it is you're going to do with these dollars.
And then digging into that, what comes to mind when you think about a really memorable grant application that you all funded? Specifically, what made it stand out? Maybe, if you can just talk about the general impact of what they were doing. You don't have to specifically name them if you don't feel comfortable doing so, but we'd love to hear specifically on that point that you made on memorability, just the best one or one of the best ones out there for you.
So this one stands out in my mind because, again, it was so concrete in telling me how these dollars were going to be used. And so this was to create a program that was going to help adults who had severe special needs to be able to participate in a program where they were going to shred paper. And that sounds so mundane to you and me, but for these individuals who oftentimes were sitting alone while they may have had some type of professional supervision, they really were not doing anything. And so they lived their lives in some case, and this is the picture that was painted. These are individuals who literally have so much to give, but people have had a hard time figuring out how to identify and put folks to work. And so this program basically just bought individual small shredders, and they encouraged businesses and other organizations to provide documents and paper that needed to be shredded. And literally the individuals would just sit there all day long and shred, but it gave them a sense of purpose, and they looked forward to going to work and having something that they did where they weren't sitting at home all day. And just the way that was described to me, it painted the picture. And I understood, you're going to buy shredders and chairs and tables, and you're going to spend some money to put out some advertising to say that you provide this service that you provide for free, and this is what people are going to do. So, it wasn't a program that affected a ton of people directly, but what they could point to was that not only is this helping the individual who now feels a greater sense of purpose in life, but the tentacles in terms of how it affects the family who is not worried about that person all day long. What are they doing all day long? It painted the picture, and that's what we like for the applications to do.
I love that. I was getting chills while you were telling that story. And I love the point where essentially they not only did an effective job talking about the program impact on immediate individuals, like along with the families, like you mentioned, but they also talked about how it connected to the local community too. And especially when crafting towards a community foundation, I'm sure you guys love to see that direct tie back, because that really goes back to the whole point behind that study that you did as well, in terms of maximizing your dollars of impact in those underrepresented areas. So it sounds like they did a phenomenal job, and it sounds like it was a great program as well to support for you guys.
It was.
When you think about, you know, the actual project themselves, and they start digging into budgets, I know that people always have a ton of questions around budgets. I'd love for you to share what differentiates the effective budgets that get funded from potentially the other rest of the applications you review.
I would say one, that it's realistic and it really includes the expenses of the program. Some of them that we've seen, when you look at it, you're like, well, what about this? And what about that? So I'd say that's the first element. The second thing is it going to be sustainable? How are they going to, if we help get this started, or if we help fund this, is this something that we're going to be asked to fund every year? Or what are your other sources of revenue for this particular program?
Got it. And that's something that has also come up on our end when it comes to our workshops. It's something where people often are asking the question of, let's say you have a maximum grant amount on your application. Do you advise people to put in the actual max amount, exactly what the program costs are, or to potentially keep it a little bit under the max to catch your attention? What are your thoughts or the foundation's thoughts around that common question from grant seekers?
That's a great question. Yeah, I would say if you need the max amount, ask for the max amount. But if you have other sources available that can help, then take that into consideration, because we have limited resources. Every foundation has limited resources. Now, what limited is going to vary from one organization to the next, but all of us have limited resources. And we have to figure out, how are we going to make a difference with those limited resources? So I can tell you, one of the things that we are often looking at is that if someone asks for, let's say $10,000, and if they get $5,000 from us, they're still going to be able to move forward with the program. They just may have to scale it back a little bit. But if the program is scalable with respect to our investment, that makes it, I don't want to say it's more attractive to us, but it probably has a greater chance of being funded. It's not that it's more attractive to us, but what it means is that we're going to be able to take our dollars and go further. Because if we can give you only $5,000 as opposed to $10,000, that means we've got another $5,000 that we can give to somebody else too.
Yeah, I think the takeaway that I'm hearing from that is just similarly to how grant seekers are often diversifying across different foundations for grants. You guys are similarly trying to diversify amongst the recipients as well. And on this topic of limits, since you introduced that as well, I know that a lot of foundations have started to introduce some form of character limits in their grant applications. I'm curious if you've seen anything creative or some tips that you might be able to provide some grant applicants when it comes to adapting responses to those character limits that often come up in their applications.
I think oftentimes that when there are character limits, there often is an opportunity for upload. I do not encourage uploading of documents that require a lot of reading, because that's, if we put character limits in there, there's a reason. But you can upload pictures, and pictures, what is the phrase? Picture
is 1,000 words.
Thank you. Thank you. So anyway, I do encourage that. But I also encourage, learn how to tell your story in fewer words. It's hard. I mean, it's hard for me to tell our story in a few words. but we all have to learn to do it. And the truth of the matter is that we all have created our, whether you call it an elevator pitch or whatever you call it, we've all created a way to share what we do succinctly. And we just need to master that. And that's one of the ways that I would encourage folks to keep those word limits, because there's a reason why we want those word limits in place. Because honestly, when it comes to reviewing all of the applications we receive, we have limited resources for that as well. So we want to make sure that we're getting the most succinct information, but also the best picture that we can in a way that is not going to overtax our own resources for reviewing.
Yeah, on that point of a picture speaks 1,000 words, we recently had a stellar support workshop in terms of what support letters stand out. And our presenter shared some incredible examples where the ones that really stood out just had those pictures of along with the letter, as opposed to just a plain, a plain form letter that wouldn't really catch somebody's eye. So definitely a great point there. Before we head into the second portion of today's conversation with Shari Martin, the president and CEO of the Cobb Community Foundation, we wanted to tell you about Instrumentl. Instrumentl helps grant seekers find, track, and manage their grants all in one place. If you'd like to give Instrumentl a try, you can sign up at www.instrumentl.com for a 14-day trial. And in the case where you're ready to upgrade for your account, you can use Foundation 50 for listening to this episode to save $50 off your first month. Nonprofits that use Instrumentl typically see an increase in their grant applications by 78% within a year of using us. Now, back to the episode. When it comes to the actual proposal evaluation process, so how your foundation approaches that, I'd love to hear how that may have changed over the years to where it's at now, and just in general the overall process there for you guys.
So I think like a lot of foundations, are making a real effort to make sure that we understand where our process may not be as inclusive as we thought it was. And looking at, I would say, in looking at board composition, one of the things that we have always looked at is the strength of their board in terms of the professional background, the ability of the board to help raise money. But the reality is we don't know all the board members. We can see pictures, we can see names, we can see backgrounds, but that doesn't necessarily tell us what we need to know. So we're starting to ask more follow-up questions. The other thing that I would say that we are doing is working really hard to identify why is an organization not getting funded, and what can we do to help with that? So it's not just, we're not awarding this grant, it's taking away from the process. Why did we not award grants to some of these organizations that really seem to be doing new and interesting things? But for example, they don't have an audit, or their financials were really not in good shape, and maybe not so much in terms of their dollar holdings or revenue, but just in terms of the presentation. And so we're trying to move away from just looking at the presentation and getting more to the meat of the information that's presented, but then also looking for opportunities to help improve presentation, to look at some capacity building grants that can help some of the organizations that didn't get a grant from us and probably didn't get a grant from other organizations for similar reasons. So I'd say the big change is really looking for opportunities to help organizations with their capacity building as a result of seeing their grant applications.
Yeah, it all comes back to that enduring impact point. And I'm sure that comes up a lot as well, since, before we started this interview, you shared how you even have to train folks on how to prepare a grant proposal. I'm curious, what are the common questions that you guys often see on your end when you guys are running those trainings for the community?
So I will tell you, we are working toward simplifying our grant proposal process so that training is no longer needed. To me, and part of that also goes to the size of our grants. We are a small community foundation. So a very large, like huge grant for us is $25,000. So our grants typically are in the $5,000 to $10,000 range. So when you think about a grant of that size, you don't want to put somebody through an awful lot of trouble for that size grant. You don't want them to have to put in $15,000 worth of work for a $10,000 grant. So we're really working towards simplifying our grant process. And so when we talk about what are the kinds of questions that we ask, it really is, don't just tell us your mission. Again, paint for us the picture of what you do every day. Who are you serving? You know, what are you trying to accomplish? And these aren't necessarily the ways that we're wording it in the grant application, but it's what we're asking. And we also want to know, where are you serving? And this is significant to us. It's not we are serving people who live in these areas. We want to know where you are providing your services. If they have to come to you to get your services, that's very different than if you are providing services in their community. So for us, that's one of the questions that we do ask quite a bit is, where are you serving? And it's very important. We word that question very deliberately. And so it's important that people answer it accurately, reading it as it was intended to be written.
That makes sense. And then before we hop into the renewal section of this conversation, the last question I'd love to ask about the overall application process is, if you were to give your one best piece of advice for applicants, what would it be?
Have somebody who doesn't know anything about your organization read the application.
That's a great
and yeah, and then have them say back to you what they just read. And if they can describe accurately what your organization does, then you've got a winner. If they can't, you need to start over.
I love that. And Shari, that goes back to your point on concision, as well as getting that elevator pitch down for your organization. Shifting gears a little bit to think a little bit more about renewing grant applications. I'm curious if your foundation reviews renewing grant applications any differently than new ones. And if so, what should renewing grant recipients prioritize in their applications?
So I would tell you at this point, and this is in the process of changing. At this point, we have not done renewable grants. That will be changing in the future, but we do renewable scholarships. And we ask many, many, many fewer questions on that type of application than we do on the original application. And believe it or not, the challenge that we have is people coming back and asking that the scholarship be renewed. So, it's really a very simple process, but it's just doing it.
And then when it comes to that process there, how important are grant reports in your evaluation to renew funding or in determining future grant making strategy?
They're critical. They're critical. If somebody doesn't send us back the report that we ask, and I will say, again, we try to keep this very simple. Mm-hmm. Just send us a few pictures, give us a paragraph or two that if the grant was just toward operating, it's just give us a paragraph or two that tells us, how your year ended up. Take the paragraph right out of, if you do an annual report, just take it out of your annual report. We really want to make it easy, but if we ask you for something, you need to provide it, because all of the dollars that we are giving came from someone else who entrusted those dollars to us to give away. We have a responsibility to make sure that we are doing that in a responsible manner. And if we don't hear back from an organization that we gave dollars to, they're likely not going to receive a grant again in the future.
And what I hear from you there is you just also being able to pull from your own wealth management background and your fiduciary duty there.
That's exactly
and that's
right.
just the importance there. Shifting gears to, where we all find ourselves right now around COVID, I'm curious, in your opinion, what trends are emerging in the relationship between grant seekers and grant makers in the post-COVID world as we look ahead past the immediate essential needs funding that was, the predominant theme of last year, and then looking ahead in the future?
What I see is grant makers and grant seekers working more closely together to develop initiatives. So for example, one of the things that we are very, very focused on is helping to put in place. Now, we don't run programs, we don't run initiatives, but we want to get them started, help get them started. But one of them is we want to help create community resource centers. And in many situations, these are houses of worship that oftentimes only have a lot of people in them once a week, one day a week. And the rest of the week, most of the building stays empty. And so we're seeing the leaders of those organizations come to us and say, look, we've got this huge building. It is part of our mission to serve our community. We want to put these rooms to use the rest of the week. And so we are working with those leaders and nonprofit organizations to try to match the organizations that are already in that area. So they're already trusted in that area with those houses of worship, so that there are wraparound services being provided at a single location. So that came out of our study, but it also came out of the relationships that we have built with nonprofits during COVID. One of the things that we did, and I think a lot of organizations, a lot of grant funders did, was made it easy to apply for a grant or didn't require an application at all. And I will tell you that was our approach. That's been our approach during COVID. We have said, because of communication processes we have put in place with the nonprofit sector, that we're not as direct before. And in terms of literally formalizing a tier of, okay, for these different verticals, I'm using my business language here, for these different verticals in the nonprofit world, we need to have one person who is actually going to be the funnel of information down to all of those organizations and back up for that one person to talk with other one persons who are representing other verticals, and all talking to us and the school system and the health department and other organizations that all need to be talking together. That didn't happen before COVID, at least not here. That is happening now. And what is key to that is making sure that those one persons are trusted and respected individuals within that vertical, who are really seeing that role in a fiduciary capacity, not as representing just their own organization. And what you can do when you have that, and you're receiving frequent and ongoing communication from trusted individuals, you can rely on that information to send the funding directly and not have to go back and say, okay, fill out this application. And it's been very helpful to them. It's been very helpful to us. And we have built relationships and strengthened relationships and deepened relationships during COVID beyond anything that I've seen before. And we're grateful for it because it allows us to simplify the process across the board. And it allows us to see the nonprofits truly as partners, not just as grant seekers. and where we are working together to try to identify solutions. And they know they can come to us and say, we're trying to get this started. And while it's a rare situation where we're going to be able to fund an entire initiative, they know that we'll go out and help them find the dollars when it's an initiative that we feel like we can get behind.
Yeah, it's often in those times of crisis when you see not only the greatest creativity, but also the greatest collaboration, and then top that all off with the greatest community as well.
Absolutely.
When you are thinking about that relationship building part, I know that that's something that newer organizations or organizations that don't have an existing relationship with your foundation might struggle with. And
Yes.
I'm curious if you have some general pointers that you might be able to share for people that were able to, work through that barrier and establish a meaningful relationship with you guys, and that you might have seen in the last few years.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, this is exactly what we said to folks during COVID. They'd say, well, how do you know if we have a need? I said, if you don't think we know, tell us. I'm not saying submit an application or submit a proposal. I'm saying pick up the phone and call us. Let's have a Zoom. So we actually have a person on staff whose title is nonprofit liaison. She's also our grants manager, so that helps tremendously. But her job is to know the nonprofits that are serving our community. And oftentimes that results in those nonprofits deciding that they want to establish an agency fund, but we will tell them our need to know who you are is our job, because we have fund holders who want to know who you are and what you do, so we can share that with them. So it is her job to know those organizations. And so I say, pick up the phone and call us. There's not a single organization that we've ever said, no, we can't talk to you. Now, there are organizations that will call me and I will say, I'm going to have you reach out to so-and-so or a Kat, her name is Catherine, we call her Kat, will call you and set up a time to chat. And some organizations say, well, we want to talk to you. You know what? I can't. I cannot talk with every single person who wants to talk with me, as much as I would love to. But we very intentionally put in place a structure to make sure that we can learn who is doing what, and you have someone that you can talk to.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, time is the great equalizer of everybody.
Right.
And the takeaway for me as a listener to what you're sharing there is, don't be afraid to pick up the phone and reach out, because a lot of times I think that overwhelms people as well, just getting to that point. But also be respectful when you're reaching out to the foundation and trying to establish that meaningful relationship. Absolutely. Well, Shari, the last question I have for you today, as we close this out, is if you had any final thoughts or helpful pointers that you think might be helpful to share in general to any other grant seekers that might be listening to this today.
So one of the things that folks have heard me say pre-COVID, during COVID, and now is the question we should be asking is not how many can my organization help? The organization, or the question should be, how many can we help? And the collective we. And we are always looking for examples of where organizations are collaborating. It's very difficult for nonprofits because there's not a single nonprofit, including ourselves, that has all the resources they need. We are all under-resourced. And so it takes time to collaborate. It takes more time to collaborate than it does to do it yourself. But the truth is, when we collaborate, we get more done across the board. And if we can start moving toward every organization, identify what is our own lane, what is it? And again, this is coming from my for-profit world. Do what you do best. Do what you do best. And then identify others who do what they do best that you also need, or that your clients also need, and then work together. So to me, that's the most important advice I could give to anyone, is do what you do best and then find someone else who does what they do best and find a way to work together.
It's from that collaboration that we get the best grant seekers and grant makers at the top of their game, impacting their communities across the board. Shari, thank you so much for hopping on today. If you'd like to learn more about the Cobb Community Foundation, you can access their website at cobbfoundation.org. And then also there will be show notes in which there's more information in reaching out to Shari's team in case you have any follow-up questions. Thanks so much, Shari.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
This concludes our conversation with Shari Martin, the president and CEO of the Cobb Community Foundation. To learn more about them, you can check them out at cobbfoundation.org. That's COBB foundation.org. If you enjoyed this interview with a grant maker, be sure to check out the other ones in our series. And if you haven't already, be sure to sign up for an Instrumentl account to get personalized grant recommendations for your nonprofit. Just access www.instrumentl.com to see your results today.